The New Orleans Saints could get second-year running back Kendre Miller back this week, but it's going to take a little bit more than a complimentary run game to get back to their winning ways. We got all of that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as the Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're going to take a look at how the Saints are already getting 2023 comparisons, what makes this year different. I'll give you my thoughts. We're also going to dive into the Saints 2024 outlook, which looks to be rapidly changing. We're going to kick everything off, though, with the fact that the New Orleans Saints could get another piece back on offense as early as this week or within the next couple of weeks in running back Kendre Miller. But it's going to take a lot more for the New Orleans Saints to get back to their winning ways. We appreciate you very much, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day, and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. The New Orleans Saints could be getting Kendre Miller back this week. I'll break down some of the IR rules and what the process is like. But first, I want to start off with the potential impact of getting Kendre Miller back, as the New Orleans Saints are kind of in search of another playmaker to help contribute to their offense. Now, the fact of the matter, if we just want to be honest and blunt here, is that second-year running back Kendre Miller is kind of the definition of potential over production, right? The Saints need a lot more production than they need potential in order to really kind of get back to their winning ways. But that doesn't mean that Kendre Miller can't turn potential into production. That's going to be the big thing that you're looking for once he does make his return to the field. The Saints have had a pretty stellar run game so far this season. Alvin Kamara has been outstanding, over 100 all-purpose yards, or 100 yards from scrimmage, rather, in each of the first 4 games of the season. His longest streak of 20-plus touches in a season is 6. He currently sits at 4, having more than 20 touches over the course of the first 4 games. So the first place where you immediately look at Kendre Miller as somebody that might be able to come in and be of assistance to the New Orleans Saints, especially as they deal with injuries to Alvin Kamara, to Taysom Hill, who also contributes in the run game, is taking some of that workload off of Alvin Kamara's shoulder. Now, Kendre Miller played a really strong game last season at the end of the year up against the Atlanta Falcons, rushed for over 70 yards, had a really stellar game in that one, but also had at an earlier point in the season this nice catch and run on a screen pass and all these other things. So you know that he's able to kind of get things done as an explosive player here and there. The issue for him has been, as is the case for many Saints draft picks, unfortunately, health and availability. Those, again, are the conversations when it comes to a New Orleans Saints high draft pick. And that's something that the Saints are going to have to be ready to deal with if Kendre Miller is dealing with more injuries or anything like that. It was a hamstring injury that kept him out for the entirety of training camp and then led to him landing on injured reserve for the first 4 weeks. We're talking about 8-9 weeks of a hamstring injury when it comes to Kendre Miller. And of course, hamstring injuries are very different depending upon the person, depending upon the grade of that hamstring injury or the severity of that hamstring injury. There's lots of different reasons for whatever that might be. But for New Orleans, this is a good opportunity for them to potentially get a player back out in the next few weeks to contribute and help on the run game. But the Saints are going to need more than just somebody to be a complementary piece in the run game, right? They've got to not give things away. They've got to not play against themselves. They've got to not beat themselves, all these other bits. And they've got to stay healthy, which has been maybe one of this team's biggest challenges for what feels like years now. So for New Orleans, getting Kendre Miller back could give them another option, but there's still other boxes that they have to check. But that doesn't mean that getting Kendre Miller back means nothing, right? It means something. It can help this team if he gets back, if he shows the explosion, and if he's in football shape. I think that's the other question mark here amongst all that too. No training camp, no first 4 games of the season, no practices. what's his conditioning look like? What's his shape look like when it comes to football shape, all that. So here's what I will say when it comes to Kendre Miller. Just because Kendre Miller is eligible to come off of injured reserve now that they are through the first 4 weeks of the season, A, doesn't mean that he will, and B, although we do expect that he will, and B, doesn't mean that he gets back to the field up against Kansas City this coming weekend. When you miss that much time, all of training camp and no practices over the first 4 weeks of the season, plus the bonus week, right, which was also lost and all that, you're probably not going right back out on the field the first week that you're back, and you're probably not ready to go right away. So just as a reminder of how injured reserve works. Injured reserve, you have to wait 4 weeks before you can be activated. That part is done. The Saints can bring him back. But instead of activating, what you're really doing is that you're opening up a practice window. So what happens is that you can welcome a player back from injured reserve and then start to get them folded into practice for 3 weeks before you effectively have, well, not effectively, before you have to make the decision. Is he going to be on your active roster, or is he going back to injured reserve for the rest of the season? Those are your two options. And so the Saints can open the practice window for Kendre Miller this week, but that doesn't necessarily mean that he plays against the Kansas City Chiefs this week. It doesn't necessarily mean that he plays against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers the week after that. But then the Saints will have to make their decision in terms of what it is that they're going to do with him, basically right around that Broncos game, week 7, the Thursday night game, which, remember, the Saints are going into a tough stretch here. They have a Monday night football game, and then they have a Sunday football game, so it's going to be a little bit of a tighter timeline there. And then they have a Thursday football game. So you've got, 3 games in 10 days in that case, 11 days, 10 days. And so that's going to be a tough stretch. So it doesn't necessarily mean that Kendre Miller comes in and immediately contributes in any of those games. It's just that the practice window is open and he's starting to work his way back. I imagine that it's going to take some time for him to get back into football shape, to get his conditioning, to get his wind under him, all these other things. But the Saints might be desperate in terms of adding another player that can contribute to their run game. Taysom Hill, dealing with not just a bruised lung injury, but came back last week, now dealing with a rib injury or an abdomen injury. We'll figure out exactly what that looks like in terms of long-term. This team also dealing with a hamstring injury when it comes to Chris Olave, broken ribs and a hip injury when it comes to Alvin Kamara. So after a certain point, you're kind of going, well, you got to get somebody out there. And Kendre Miller might be the new face that has the ability to be able to contribute, but I wouldn't expect it to happen immediately. So the Saints could be getting a reinforcement back when it comes to their run game, but it doesn't mean that things are going to immediately get better for the New Orleans Saints because of that one ingredient. The Saints, if they're going to get better, or if things are going to get better around the New Orleans Saints, it's because of what the team does. It's not because of one new face showing up and being available for the team. So still a lot of different things, a lot of boxes that they'll need to check. But once they can do that, then hopefully they can get back to their winning ways, especially with their 2024 season outlook currently on the brink. So up next, we're going to take a look at their 2024 outlook and how it's rapidly changed, but there is time to save it. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, where you can start your season off with some big returns at FanDuel.com. Right now, FanDuel's got the New Orleans Saints as 5.5-point underdogs in Kansas City on Monday Night Football, going up against the Chiefs this week, rather. A big spread for New Orleans, who have typically either won big or lost close. So maybe you like that 5.5-point spread for the Saints to at least cover that. And look, Kansas City, right? Some of the least explosive plays in the NFL so far this year. So maybe that gives you an opportunity to keep this score a little bit closer, even if you think the Saints aren't going to be able to pull off the victory. So go and check it out over at FanDuel.com, where you can get started today. And especially if you're getting started, you're a new customer, you can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. Your first $5 bet, $200 in bonus bets as a new customer, guaranteed. Go and check it out today at FanDuel.com. All right, family, in case you were nervous, the season still far from over for the New Orleans Saints, who rank as one of the NFL history's best 2-2 teams. there's some parts of that sound great. There are other parts of it that don't sound so great. So let's break it all down. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here for another episode of Locked On Saints. Our good friend Aaron Schatz, who we had on before the season began over at FTN Fantasy, as well as the creator of the DVOA analytic, which kind of breaks down an average across the NFL on how teams perform on situational play-by-play basis, i.e., a 3-yard run on 3rd and 6 is weighted differently than a 3-yard run on 3rd and 1. So really just kind of contextualizes the way that NFL football is played and how teams do, sets an average, and then you either come in at above or below that average, and then that's kind of the way that DVOA works. And my quick explainer, really good stuff from Aaron, and one of the analytics that I trust the most. And looking at those analytics right now, the New Orleans Saints are number 4 amongst 2-2 teams since 1979 when it comes to a list of the best 2-2 teams because of how well they performed on a DVOA scale. Right now, the New Orleans Saints sit at 37.4%, plus 37.4% when it comes to DVOA. So well above the average there, with the 2003 Tampa Bay Buccaneers just above them at 37.9%. The 2024 Baltimore Ravens, right? This year's Baltimore Ravens, 38.3%. So less than 1% dividing the New Orleans Saints at 4, and the 2024 Baltimore Ravens, who are sitting at 2 amongst the best 2-2 teams since 1979. The concern, though, for the New Orleans Saints is when you look at what the results of the other top 13 teams, right? The Saints and the Ravens are within that top 25, so we don't know their top 15, so we don't know their results just yet. But when you look at the results, playoff-wise and stuff like that, over the course of those other 13 teams, it's not the greatest company to keep. I will say a couple different things that work in the positive for New Orleans from a record standpoint, all right? So amongst the other teams that kind of fall in this category, they are 134, 74, and 1 over the course of games played. So 134 wins, 74 losses, and 1 tie. So these are teams that started 2-2, and then you're grouping them all together in terms of the ones that are kind of in this elite DVOA plus or plus DVOA kind of category. So that's a 64.4% win percentage in a 17-game season. That's about a 10 or 11 win team. So that could still end up being the New Orleans Saints, who could end this season with 10 wins, could end this season with 11 wins. They could also, based on their health, based on the way that things have looked so far, based on them kind of repeating some old patterns, based on them beating themselves, could be a 7-win team too. So we just don't know, but we'll see where things end for New Orleans. But if they ended 10-7 or 11-6, we'd certainly be talking about them very differently later on than we talk about them at this point. Now, here's the tricky part, though. None of the other 13 teams, even if that were the reality for the New Orleans Saints, none of those other 13 teams have won a Super Bowl. None, and only one of them have advanced beyond the conference championship game and then ended up losing in the Super Bowl. That was the 2025 Seattle Seahawks. Beyond that, 4 teams that are also in this category: the 2003 Tampa Bay Buccaneers, the 2005 then San Diego Chargers, the 1993 New York Jets, as well as the 1985 Denver Broncos, didn't make the playoffs. So these are a lot of exits in the wild card, divisional, or conference championship game rounds. But I'll be honest. If the New Orleans Saints made it to the divisional round, that's probably better than you expected that they were going to be going into this season. So it's not all bad just because it could end in a disappointing playoff loss. But it is interesting because the Saints have gone from being in Super Bowl winning company. When I talk about Super Bowl winning company, I mean scoring 91 points in the first 2 games of the season. The only team to do better than that was 2009 New Orleans Saints, who of course won the Super Bowl that year. They scored 93 points at the beginning of the season in their first 2 games. And the Saints tied with the Super Bowl winning Dallas Cowboys team at 91 points through the first 2 weeks. So they went from being in the Super Bowl winning company to being in this disappointing playoff loss company. But based on how things have been over the course of the past 3 years, playoff less for the New Orleans Saints, getting to the playoffs and even advancing beyond just the wild card round, that's still kind of a win for the New Orleans Saints, if we're being honest, who were looking to kind of change that that curve of the playoff drought. This is not a Super Bowl or a bust win team, or a Super Bowl win or bust team. This is a can you be better than you were last year team. And I think that there are some metrics here that show that they are still in the conversation with the possibility to be there, but of course are not guaranteed to be there. So that's got to be a big thing that the New Orleans Saints end up kind of looking to traverse in terms of the landscape that's ahead of them and the outlook that's ahead of them, because it is declining at the moment, that outlook. And here's the thing is that when it comes down to it, it might get worse before it gets better. The New Orleans Saints are unfortunately in a situation where they have the Kansas City Chiefs coming up next. And with the Kansas City Chiefs coming up next, two-time Super Bowl champion, although they have not been the explosive team that they have been, they will be without Isaiah Pacheco. They will be without Rashee Rice. So they will be missing some big pieces. The one piece that they're not missing, though, or the two pieces that they're not missing, though, are Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. And in a close second, Steve Spagnuolo and what has been a really good defense over there. So things might get might stay rough for New Orleans for just a second before the schedule lightens up, and then there is the opportunity for them to rip off 8 wins before the season is done. We'll see if they're able to get that done. And I'll tell you what, doing so wouldn't be too terribly hard if they can fix one simple issue. And fixing that one simple issue is that they have to put themselves in positions where they are simply competing with the opponent that's across from them, as opposed to contributing to the opponent that's across from them. And we saw that in that Atlanta Falcons game, which is a game that the New Orleans Saints absolutely should have won. We saw a version of it, not so much, but we saw a version of it up against the Philadelphia Eagles a week before as well, particularly in the late game stretch, where, as we broke down in yesterday's episode, the Saints have had some real trouble closing out late game or games wherein they have held late leads. So if they can get out of their own way and just be able to play against the team that is their opposition, then they might be able to kind of curb this trajectory that they're on so far and save their season. I think that has to be the biggest thing. Bigger than any Kendre Miller return, bigger than any healthy, I think that's health is still a big part of it, right? Like that's always going to be a big thing. But bigger than, getting an extra running back or trading for a wide receiver or signing a new wide receiver or whatever is going to be not shooting yourself in the foot. That's going to be bigger than anything else. So the Saints are in this sort of weird space right now to where they look an awful lot like the team from last year in one aspect, but there's so much still different about this team that it is worth still acknowledging the potential historically of what it means to be one of the NFL's best 2-2 teams. It doesn't stamp you a ticket to the Super Bowl. It doesn't stamp you a Super Bowl win, but it certainly has proven so far, with the exception of 4 out of those top 13 teams, that teams can turn things around and have what it takes to turn things around to become a playoff team. Let's see if the New Orleans Saints can get that done. I just wanted to share that metric and the information is absolutely out there to support that the Saints can still turn things around. Up next, the New Orleans Saints, despite the fact that they have the ability to turn things around, or at least it looks like they do, they're already getting the 2023 comparisons, and so far, they deserve it. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at Game Time, the best place to go to buy tickets for your favorite sporting events, concerts, comedy, theater, whole bunch of stuff that you can find over on Game Time. And it's great, especially if you're somebody who travels and you want to do something kind of spontaneous, or you're not sure what's going on when you're out of town, where you're headed. Download the Game Time app, open it up, take a look at all the different events that are going on, and you'll be able to find tickets to those events, as tickets typically actually get cheaper the closer you get to the event because of things like flash deals and zone deals and so much more. And right now with Game Time picks, even if you're overwhelmed with the number of options that you have, they're going to be able to do a little bit of curating to make it easier for you to be able to save more on sports, comedy, theater, etc. So make sure you go and check that out. You can also toggle on all-in pricing so that you can see your total up front without any surprise fees by the time you get to checkout. I love Game Time. Why? Because they help you take the guesswork out of buying tickets. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. What time is it? Game time. Let's Get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode with a look at where the New Orleans Saints are drawing some not so great comparisons so far after a 2-win start and then a 2-win losing streak to follow that up. The Saints right now kind of feel like they're right back where they left off in 2023. They need to change that rhythm quickly if they want to make sure that things start to kind of right the ship a little bit, right? Like we just talked about the optimism that exists based upon some of the things that they've done. Now let's take a look at some of the criticism that exists because of what the Saints have done so far. And both are deserved, right? Like there's two sides to every coin here. And so looking at where New Orleans has the potential to go versus looking at where New Orleans presently is are going to tell two different stories, right? So I want to make sure we're telling both of those stories. It just makes sense. New Orleans has everything that they need to be able to take advantage of the opportunities that will eventually present themselves for New Orleans to be able to kind of right the ship, as we mentioned, and get back to maybe that, division competing team conversation, right? We'll see where things go for them. But right now they're 2-2 behind the Atlanta Falcons because of a head-to-head loss and a disappointing game. And they're also behind the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are 3-1. So the Saints right now sit in third place in the division, and they're looking to get out of that hole. Well, things might get a little bit worse before they get better. As we mentioned just a moment ago, they have not only the Kansas City Chiefs on the way, or rather they're about to be on their way to the Kansas City Chiefs for Monday Night Football, but they also have the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on the way, who have looked pretty good so far this season, although they had, like, their one loss was a pretty remarkable loss, right? So it's a beatable team. Kansas City has some beatable attributes, but they're still the Kansas City Chiefs. So we'll see where things go when it comes to all that. But honestly, for New Orleans, like these next 2 weeks might be rough, and then things kind of start to settle out a little bit. You know, we don't really know who the Denver Broncos are at this time. They had a really, really nice performance over on the defensive side, which is going to be a big thing to watch. But they don't have the typical Sean Payton offensive prowess with Bo Nix at the moment. Then you've got the Los Angeles Chargers, who have had some ups and downs, Carolina Panthers, who have been absolutely dreadful, back to the Atlanta Falcons again, to where if you can welcome them to New Orleans and not hand them 14 points, you're probably in a better situation. And then you got the Cleveland Browns before the bye week, who also look absolutely dreadful. Then after the bye week, you got a tough game against the Rams, an awful New York Giants team, a really good Commanders team thanks to their quarterback play, a struggling Green Bay Packers team, a Raiders team, and then a Tampa Bay Buccaneers team to end up the season. So can the Saints win 8 more games this season with that? Sure. The issue, though, is that what New Orleans has done already so far this season mimics what they've been doing over the course of the past 2 years, which is the roller coaster. Win 2 games, lose 2 games. Win a game, lose a game, right? So even if the Saints were to turn around and win this game and shock the world in terms of knocking off Kansas City on Monday Night Football in front of the national audience, all that other stuff, I believe Derek Carr is 3 of 14 against the Kansas City Chiefs in his career. So he's got experience playing against the Kansas City Chiefs. He's also got experience struggling against the Kansas City Chiefs, or his team struggling against the Kansas City Chiefs, which it's the Kansas City Chiefs who hasn't. But could he get his 4th win against Kansas City in a New Orleans Saints uniform and then turn around and drop a game to Tampa Bay Buccaneers the very next week? Like, the roller coaster of the New Orleans Saints, who have not been able to remain consistent when it comes to winning ways, is something that you absolutely have to pay attention to, because it's what we have seen already so far this season. It doesn't mean that it's what we're going to see as the season continues on, but certainly something to keep an eye out on, and certainly something that we're going to be watching for as a part of the reason why it's really tough to maybe trust the New Orleans Saints at this time. So what makes this year different? I think the thing that makes this team different right now is that they have an offense that works. Last year, they did not have an offense that worked. And some people will say that that's because of Pete Carmichael. Some people will say that it's because of execution. Some people will say that it's because of Derek Carr. Whatever. I really don't care who you point the finger at. Everybody deserves a finger pointed at them for the way that they performed last season and the way that they performed the season before as well, which some of those people weren't a part of. So I think for New Orleans, I think the thing that makes them a better team right now, it makes this 2-2. I don't want to say it makes it different than last year's 2-2, but makes it potentially different than last year's 2-2 in terms of their ability to be able to actually like turn things around at some point this season. I don't think it happens immediately. I'm not going to be surprised if the Saints come out of week 6 2-4 or 3-3. But even if they were to do that, it still feels very different than last year. A couple of reasons. I mentioned that the offense is actually a good offense. Again, up against Atlanta, I didn't see anything wrong with the play calling. This wasn't an offense that was held back from its producers being able to produce. You had 2 wide receivers over 80 yards. You had a 100-yard from scrimmage running back. You'd love to see the tight ends more involved. So maybe there's something there. There were these play calls here and there that maybe were questionable, and those were the play calls that you just kind of live and die by, right? Like those play calls that make you look like a genius when they work, and then when they don't work, you bring in a lot of criticism, and you're okay with dealing with that if you're a coordinator, right? The tosses on 3rd and short, or even 3rd and medium and stuff like that. Like, fine, you'll take those. But when it and then I saw like criticism around the Saints sneaking it twice at the goal line, and that's just an example of not really kind of understanding what the Saints are doing in that situation, to where you're okay not scoring because you want to run the clock out. And I think I saw one thing to where somebody recognized and said that they should have given the ball to Taysom Hill, who was already rolled out of the game at that point, and all this other stuff. So that's just a lack of familiarity with what it is that the Saints do, have done, will do, all those kinds of things. That's fine. It happens. But I do think that New Orleans has a better offense this year than they had last year. So I do think that is a separating factor from 2023 to 2024. The concern, though, is that the defense has not been what you expect the New Orleans Saints defense to be. The one thing that a lot of people sort of felt like, myself included, coming into the season was like, oh, well, that's the one thing you don't have to worry about is the defense. The Saints right now rank 7th in the NFL when it comes to rushing yards allowed, but they rank 19th in the NFL they rank 25th in the NFL when it comes to passing yards allowed. That is very uncharacteristic for New Orleans. The thing about it, though, is that the Saints are not allowing passing touchdowns. They've allowed a passing touchdown so far this season. A single one. One passing touchdown. They're number 1 in the NFL when it comes to allowing scoring to opposing passing games. And so even though they're letting up more yards than usual, they're still the 6th ranked defense when it comes to points scored, and they're still the 17th ranked defense when it comes to yardage allowed. You give up the yards, that's fine, but if you're not giving up the scores, you'll take that, right? Like, again, a game where you just gave up four field goals and no offensive touchdowns, you expect to win that game, and the Saints absolutely should have won that game. So I think that that's the other thing. The third thing that I think that's different for the New Orleans Saints, that works in their favor again, is that this is not a team at this moment that feels like one that is kind of looking at things and going, they're not in the dumps, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? Like, they don't feel like a team right now that's doubting themselves. And you can kind of feel a little bit of that, not necessarily doubt, but you certainly felt a little bit of the frustration early on last season. You're not feeling any of that frustration right now when you're in the Saints locker room and all that. There's the individual frustration of losing a game, but there's an individual frustration of losing a game because they feel like they should have won it, not because they don't have an identity, which was some of the early criticisms that we heard from Saints players themselves, right? Alvin Kamara, very overt last season about not having an identity and no accountability and all these other things. You're not hearing any of that stuff. So I put both of those things up, the better offense and the better attitude, better sort of like mental positioning for this team, as a reason why looking at the optimism does have value, because it is there, but the defense concerns you. And that's understandable. So the Saints have got to be able to kind of figure things out here as they move forward. But really, their own worst enemy at the moment is themselves. And if they can circumvent that, then this could be a team that's in line to save its season. But as of right now, they're looking an awful lot like 2023. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL. You want to check out Locked On Pelicans as well. Our good friend Jake Madison at Pelicans Media Day got some of the biggest names in the Pelicans organizations. Make sure you go and check out all the great stuff that Jake's got going on over at Locked On Pelicans. We appreciate you very much, as always, making us your first listen, and for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.